post call here. And then we have the body. And as soon as I click into one of these fields that allows me to put some text into that, that's when this dynamic content window of Logic Apps pops up. And this has all the parameters that I previously defined that are defined in the schema available. So for example, in Lifecycle Workflows, we have a subject, and the subject is the person for which the workflow is running. So in this case, I could go and say, well, I have a subject display name, or I have a subject user ID. And this is information about our
Hello, everybody. Today, we're going to be joining on the 425 show to talk about one of my favorite topics. And of course, that's identity governance. But this time, we're going to be focusing on customizations that you can achieve without writing code. So I know this opens up a lot of automation for a lot of organizations which may not have developers. So I'm really excited to have our guest today. Alex, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you for having me, Jeff. Welcome, everyone. Good day, good afternoon, wherever you are around the world. I'm Alexander Filipin. I'm one of the product managers working on Microsoft Entra ID Governance, and super excited to talk about custom extensions and workflows today.
And with that, I'm Jeff Kazimer. I'm a principal product manager in our customer experience engineering team. Now, you may have seen us on 425 show before. So if this is your first time joining us, please like and subscribe the channel. We have a lot of great content we're always bringing, and you want to be aware of topics like Alex is going to talk about today. So Alex, where do we begin when we talk about these custom extensions?
Yeah, I mean, let me give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about over today. So we will talk a little bit about the fundamentals of custom extensions and obviously the use cases. I think that's the most important thing when we get started, to understand when to use them and for what to use them. And then we will dive into the prerequisites, the configuration, some of the integration patterns that we have, and also dive a little deeper into the error handling, troubleshooting, and the security considerations around these custom extensions.
Now, this is a lot to cover, and if you're not a developer, you may be thinking, whoa, this is maybe not something I'm interested in. But if you're an IT admin who's doing a lot of common tasks, we've talked about LCW before, but we're going to show about using these customizations in a low-code or no-code way to walk you through this. So this will be a lot of some slide work front, but we will be doing live hands-on demos of actually creating these custom extensions to use in your workflow. So stay tuned for those.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And that's a good transition into just recapping very briefly why identity governance is important and what kind of role custom extensions can play in that. From an identity governance perspective, we're really trying to improve the security posture of an organization, right? We don't want lingering accounts, lingering access around. We want to also reduce cost, and that's cost we primarily reduce by reducing repetitive manual tasks, right? And that's where especially these automation aspects of custom extensions can come in and help. But also when we look at identity governance, we also need to manage compliance risk. And there we also have integration patterns that we'll talk about later, where these custom extensions can actually help me with my governance, compliance checks, and embed them into my governance processes more efficiently. And lastly, we have also increased user productivity and experience that we can achieve with these, because we will see a set of automation tasks that we can achieve with custom extensions that simply help that things are properly set up on the first day, for example, when someone joins the organization.
Now, what I wanted to highlight here is that if you're watching this, you may be thinking, well, identity governance, we don't do that. We don't need that. I will tell you, every organization, from your small organization to your large mega corporation, has the need for identity governance. Because as you see, as we've talked about before, you have people who are joining your organization, moving around, and leaving your organization. And it's really key how you bring management and governance to take the proper action when these events happen. And with that, let's go into sort of how we can apply that.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, and there's identity governance is a large area, and we're not going to dive into them in detail today because we have other sessions that we've talked a bit that cover that as well. But just to flash you some ideas about all the areas that identity governance is touching, right? It's the identity lifecycle that Jeff just mentioned, joiner mover leaver process, it's access recertification, it's entitlement management, that people have the right access, right? These are all areas of identity governance. And without going into great detail of them, it's important to also understand that our Microsoft Entra ID Governance offering that we have primarily consists of like 5 core features that help organizations achieve their business requirements in these governance areas. And these are lifecycle workflows, entitlement management, access reviews, privileged identity management, and our HR and app provisioning capabilities. So if you haven't heard about them, I'm sure Jeff has a lot to tell about how you can find out more about them.
Now, that's a good reminder, because if you're watching us live, you can ask questions right here. So whether you're on Twitch, you're on LinkedIn, you're on YouTube, please use the chat, and the rest of our team who are monitoring the chat will bring those questions on screen, so myself and Alex can answer them live for you.
Perfect. Yes, and with that, we are ready to jump into custom extensions and dive really deep into the technical.
Alex, I just want to highlight, before we go custom, some people may be listening and not understanding fully what is out of the box with LCW. So if you have just joining us for custom, the previous videos that Alex had on screen will actually walk you through the entire overview and the lifecycle workflows overview. But we're not going to spend time on those details because we've already covered those, as Alex said. But I just want to highlight, if you want to start there, definitely watch those videos. But now let's talk about customizations.
Yes, very good point, Jeff. And that's the important first thing to call out for custom extensions. These are there to extend the Microsoft Entra ID Governance capabilities that we have with your organization-specific process and business logic. So when we think about how Microsoft sees, or how we see identity governance, right? Then we have purpose-built solutions with the features that I just named: lifecycle workflows, entitlement management, and in all of these features, there are already workflows and business processes happening. But every organization is usually very unique and has very unique requirements and processes that they might want to achieve. And that's where custom extensions come in crucial, because they are there to get embedded into our identity governance process, and basically embed Azure Logic Apps into these governance processes, so that you have a low-code configuration with hundreds of managed connectors that we can embed in these purpose-built processes that we already have in our governance stack.
Now, I do think we have some questions coming from the audience, and I think it's very appropriate because we're talking about custom extensions with no code, but we've had existing IGA solutions before, such as Microsoft Identity Manager, which, if you've worked with that before, does require a level of development skills, or using one of the open source libraries like the MIM wall, right? So we've published guidance on the roadmap and support lifecycle for MIM, but I would recommend that every organization, if you have Microsoft Identity Manager or other third-party IGA tools, really start looking at the Entra identity governance capabilities. We did a great overview video of how it's much more than just what MIM offers, as well as other platforms. So I definitely would start there.
Yes. Very good question. And Jeff, just to add on that, right, I think it's also important to understand, as a MIM customer, the workflows that might be happening in a MIM environment, they might not all map to lifecycle workflows, or might not all map to custom extensions. You have to look at the business scenario that these workflows in MIM are currently trying to solve. And then some of them might be solved natively, for example, by our entitlement management capabilities.
And I when I talk to a customer who has MIM, who has developed their custom workflows using, like, say, the workflow activity library, it's not a one-for-one, because the things that you may be doing in those other platforms, those tasks that you want to achieve may be out of the box, they may be custom, or because you've modernized how you are managing your environment, you may not be doing the same task at all. So it's a great opportunity. How do you modernize your IGA and automation by reviewing those? Now, the other question I see here is home lab for training. What ways can you learn to work with this to scale, test, and deploy? So when I recommend somebody getting started, if you have a Visual Studio developer account, there's some great free resources, an Entra tenant, your Azure resources. Bringing those together, you get a little bit of everything to sort of experience all those identity features and use those Azure resources to build Azure Logic Apps. So I definitely would start there, or look at some of the other subscriptions.
Perfect. Yeah, and with that, it's important to call out that I just mentioned we have a broad set of identity governance offerings in our identity governance offering, and the two core capabilities that currently support custom extensions, like extending these business processes, are lifecycle workflows and entitlement management. Now, custom extensions as a concept itself, like extending existing Microsoft Entra processes, are not unique to our governance stack. In our authentication experience, we actually leverage the same concept of custom extensions to enrich tokens when customers to enrich tokens with additional claims when end users authenticate to applications. So the concept of a custom extension, some of the concepts I'm going to explain today are also applicable to the authentication experience, but I will very much zoom in on the governance aspect. So not everything that I will say will be 100% accurate for the authentication experience as well. But I just want to call out common concept, not just used in our governance stack.
And I think it's a very important thing, because I've worked with other IGA platforms that have workflows. And a lot of those are sort of what I call unitasker. You learn that workflow language, that expression, that skill set that only applies to that one area. But because we're building these workflows across all the features of Entra, you can utilize all the hundreds of connectors, those same skills, and also be able to staff and support these kind of environments. So we get away from that model of custom code not being able to support, to a model where we have low code, no code that is largely supportable because it's used, but then more than just one thing. So when I think of skills for IT admins, I typically say no PowerShell, no KQL or Kusto query language. And because of our usage of Azure Logic Apps, you're seeing why it's an important skill for IT admins.
Perfect. Yeah. And with that, let's talk a little bit about the use cases that we can solve with custom extensions. And of course, that differs a little bit when they're used in entitlement management versus when they're used in lifecycle workflows. But for example, in entitlement management, we can achieve integrations with ITSM systems, for example, ServiceNow, to ensure that tickets are created when we want access provisioning to happen in disconnected systems that we cannot connect automatically to Microsoft Entra. Similar, we can send custom notification to additional stakeholders. We can also enrich them with external governance, risk, and compliance checks. If you want to perform and have an existing GRC system, for example, want to embed that in your governance processes on the Entra side. And then, of course, on the lifecycle workflow side, we have a broad set of scenarios where we just want to automate additional organizational specific join and mover lever tasks that have to happen. And Jeff, I'm not sure, do you want to share some of the scenarios that you have seen in the wild, that you have seen from customers here in the community?
Yeah, so definitely onboarding, getting that additional information from a requester, or now in the case of onboarding users, to get verified metadata from verified credentials, feeding that into an extension to populate that on users to really drive a lot of governance process. That is something I'm definitely seeing grow. And if you haven't heard, you can enable verified credentials to Entra tenant, issue from Entra tenants now. So I'll see a lot of growth happening there. Now, I do think we have a question about custom extensions from the audience, though. So currently using the MSDS Cloud Extension attribute to ship custom attributes like employee hire for HR provisioning. Is this correct or preferable different custom attribute? So great question. So if Alex, do you want to talk about the attribute sync, or do you want me to cover that?
I can speak to it a little bit. So in general, the sync using the cloud extension attribute for synchronizing the hire data in a hybrid environment is totally fine. We don't have a dedicated attribute in the on-prem AD schema where you could push it to. That's not an investment we have made so far. So cloud extension attribute is something we would recommend and actually have also documented. Jeff, any additional thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I just want to point out the cloud extension attribute is my go-to attribute. And the reason why is because as organizations are really moving away from on-premises Exchange, they're moving to Exchange in the cloud. They're not always adding those schema extensions in their AD for those classic extension attributes. And those extension attributes that we're familiar with, the 1 through 15, those are really meant for the global address list. You probably don't want to put more data in them. So I like using the cloud extension attributes on-prem, synchronizing that to Entra, and then building those activities using LCW on those.
Perfect.
So great question. So if you are working in a development environment, right, we recently have announced a new Entra ID Governance SKU. So anybody who has a Premium 1 or Premium 2 tenant can go enable that trial. So I would definitely recommend going to the trial and enabling that in your development environment. Now, that is good for 30 days. We are looking at how we can extend those for developers, but I have no information to share today.
All right. There's one more I see.
A lot of questions. I love getting questions
keep
on
coming.
here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please keep shooting in.
Will we be reviewing application directory extensions that can be used in SAML claims? So no, that probably is not part of this because we're talking about calling workflows, which may set those attributes that you may utilize to issue SAML claims. But authentication and custom claims is not something we'll be covering today. I'm sure we'll have previous topics on this, but maybe it'll be a topic in the future. And Alex, with that, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you. No, thank you for all the good questions. Before we're about to jump into like kind of the prerequisites and configuration aspect, but before we jump into that, I wanted to make one more comment. There's a slight distinction to be made. I said that custom extensions are there to extend the identity governance process with your very organizational specific processes and business logic. And that's totally right. And that's the main purpose for them. I will highlight that there are some other scenarios where we simply have them currently on our roadmap, but custom extensions can also help you to unblock these scenarios where we are still coding and giving our best to ship these features in the future, for example, additional tasks or additional capabilities in entitlement management. And we are always taking a close look at what are our customers using custom extensions for, to also evaluate, like, is there something that is very common across customers that we have not solved in our in our product? And then well, at the end of the day, we make a call if we want to leverage that up and actually build a native solution where you don't have to take that extra step. It is a low-code solution, but there are some steps involved in configuring that we will see. And so keep in mind, if you see something where you feel like, why do I need custom extensions for that? Solve it natively, let us know, and we're open to do that. And it's a great tool to also see what customers are using it for, to get better insights on what's missing.
Yeah, and it's a good point. Highlighting the customer feedback drives some of where we put our investment. So if there's areas that we can improve the platform, definitely let us know.
All right, sorry, that was not intended. Let me go back to my slide. There we are. So talking about prerequisites, before we can get started, since we are integrating with Azure Logic Apps, one thing that you will need to get started is an Azure subscription and a resource group. And on that Azure subscription, you will need permissions from an Azure role perspective, which is at a minimum Logic App contributor. There are these more generic, not least privilege roles of contributor and owner that would also work, but Logic App contributor would be the recommended permissions on the recommended permission on the Azure side. And then on the Microsoft Entra side, depending on which feature you use, you would need the identity governance administrator or the lifecycle workflow administrator role. But it doesn't have to be always a pure admin from an IT team perspective. As you probably know, entitlement management supports delegation and supports a business delegation model where you can delegate to business units to manage their own permissions more effectively on their own. And so in that case, they can also create custom extensions if they have very IT very people with certain IT skills, right, in their department. Then they can also leverage custom extensions with the catalog owner permission that we have for business delegation. They're able to create them as well in entitlement management. And if you have a business delegation model for Azure subscriptions as well, then that would work just fine. From that, let's talk a little bit about the configuration experience. And really, custom extensions are a three-step process. Initially, we're going to create what we call the custom extension via the Microsoft Entra portal. And the Microsoft Entra portal will take care of creating the Logic app in a compatible way. We will talk a little bit more about what that means, but basically, if you create the custom extension with the Entra portal, it will take away all the complexity of configuring the logic app in a certain way that it will, and it will automatically work with the governance feature. And then as a second step, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say, the steps sound like it's a lot, but the team actually worked a lot on templatizing this. So from an admin perspective, it's a few clicks, a few answers, and we generate all the logic apps for you. So you don't really have to be as nuanced with the underpinnings of logic apps.
Yes, that's correct. And then, yeah, the second step is pretty much building your business logic within the Azure Logic app. And that, well, it depends totally on you and your business scenario that you want to solve, how you would do that. And we will see some examples and dive into that, how you can use logic apps for that. But then lastly, you will have to link the custom extension to your identity governance process, right? So we need to put them together. Basically, the custom extension just holds information about that external system that we're integrating with, in this case, Azure Logic app. And then as a third step, we want to embed it in that identity governance process that is happening in lifecycle workflows, in entitlement management, and we need to map it to the given access package, to the given access package policy, or the given lifecycle workflow, and embed it as a task in a given lifecycle workflow. All right. With that, Jeff, I think we're ready to jump in.
Let's go. So Alex, let's walk through how we actually configure these workflows in the governance today. Where should we begin?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So let's jump into the Microsoft Entra Admin Center. And in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center, you can find our lifecycle workflows and entitlement management features under the identity governance bucket. And so if we go to lifecycle workflows, you will see that right on the navigation menu of lifecycle workflows, we have a section that is called custom extension. And that's where you can create the custom extension that we just talked about. And then on the entitlement management side, we'll do a quick jump over to that. In the entitlement management side, if you go to the catalogs area and you select a given catalog that you have, you will find the custom extension area within the catalog section of that, within the custom extension section of that catalog.
So just to clarify, so when I'm defining a custom extension in lifecycle workflows, I'm doing it at the root of lifecycle workflows. But when I'm doing custom extensions and entitlement management, I'm doing it at the catalog level. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. So lifecycle workflows right now, everything is on tenant level, the workflows, etc. And then entitlement management, since we have our business delegation model, you create the custom extensions contained within a catalog. All right, with that.
Makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, with that, let's take a quick look at the very basic creation experience. As I explained earlier, we have a three-step process, right? Creating the custom extension that creates the logic app, defining your business logic, and linking the custom extensions to your business process. So let's look at that three-step process. And we're going to do it on the lifecycle workflow side first, but we're going to look at both sides on the entitlement management side as well. So we go into the custom extension section, and then we simply use the add a custom extension option. And here we have to define some basic parameters, like what our custom extension is going to be called. In this case, we're going to make an example where we want to, as part of a joiner workflow, make sure that a ServiceNow ticket gets created for hardware procurement to ensure that a laptop, for example, gets prepared for a new hire in time. So we give this custom extension a name, and then a name and description. And then the next thing we have to select is what we call the lifecycle workflow task behavior. And this actually determines if the logic app is just getting started from the lifecycle workflow and the lifecycle workflow proceeds without caring what the logic app does or if it succeeds, or if the second behavior, if the lifecycle workflow is going to wait for a response from the logic app. We're going to dive more into these patterns later. For now, we will stick with the simple pattern, launch and continue. And the only other details that we need now is where do we actually create this logic app that is underpinning the custom extensions and that we are able to start. So for that, we will need our Azure subscription, as explained earlier in our prerequisite section. and we have to select a resource group. So in this case, let's select the resource group that we have here, and let's give this a name as well. And then we can hit on create logic app, and this will now deploy the logic app in a compatible manner, already pre-configured for lifecycle workflows. Gonna take a few moments here, and then we can finalize the creation.
So essentially, we're just picking the base configuration, and this will instantiate the template, right?
Yes. So we're gonna take a quick we're gonna take a closer look at the logic app in a second, and there's a few puzzle pieces that we are pre-configuring on the logic app. So yes, we have a template behind the scenes that is being leveraged here as the logic app gets deployed. And so now we can complete the creation, and we have our custom extension created. And in the custom extensions plate, you can see I have a few here related to our show today. And one of them is the one that we just created. You could click right here and then jump into the logic app experience. We are not going to do that for a second, because what I want to show you before we jump into logic app is actually the last part of this 3-step process. So we're going to skip the second part, which is configuring the logic app and building your business logic in there for a second. And we're going to take a quick look on how do you actually link that custom extension to your business process. So in lifecycle workflows, you would have your joiner, mover, leaver workflows, and we're just going to jump into one here right now. And within the task section of your lifecycle workflow, you configure which task gets executed. And among all the supported built-in tasks that we have that you can see here, we're not going to go into detail with them. One of the tasks that we have is called run a custom task extension. So if we add this task, then we have to select what custom task extension should be executed. And if we go in here, we will get a drop down with all the custom task extensions that exist in my tenant in this case, and I can select the one that I just created, and then as part of the workflow execution, this custom extension will get executed.
So in this model, we can create the custom extensions centrally in the tenant and then reuse them or utilize them in each custom task. Is that correct?
Yes, so we can reuse a custom extension that we have created centrally for the tenant in multiple of our workflows. That's possible. Yes.
Makes sense.
And then on the entitlement, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Question though about the continue workflow execution on error. What exactly is that?
Yes, so this is a setting that we actually have for all of our tasks. So this is not specific to the extensibility pattern or the custom task extension. Even if we go to enable user account here, you will see that we have the same setting that is continue workflow execution on error. So lifecycle workflows, the feature itself executes its task in a sequential order. So it's first going to see, in this example, it's first going to enable the user account, then it's going to run this custom task extension that is configured here, then it's going to add users to groups. So, and you're able to decide what happens if a failure occurs in one of these tasks. Does the workflow proceed to the next task, or does it stop the complete workflow and doesn't even try to proceed to the next step? And
so if, let's say my task was to send an email, right? And if that failed, that is not exactly a process ending event. So I want to continue.
Correct. Yes. That's one of the options. It's really very scenario specific. I will make one more specific comment to the extensibility pattern, right? Now, I briefly talked about the two patterns in the task behavior earlier with launch and continue and launch and wait. In this launch and continue pattern, the only way that the task would actually fail here is if for some reason we couldn't start the logic app. If Lifecycle Workflows is unable to start the logic app, then we would consider the task as failed. But in the launch and continue pattern, as long as we can start it, the task will be considered a success. Versus in the launch and wait pattern, that not only do we have to successfully start the logic app, we also need to get successful feedback that the external process that was running in the logic app actually completed. If we don't get that, then once again, we would consider the task failed. So there's a slight interaction with the two task behaviors that we saw earlier and that we will dive deeper a little bit later from a theory perspective as well. All right. With that, we're going to make a quick jump. And just to remind everyone, 3-step process: create the custom extension that gives us the logic app as well. Define your business logic in the logic app. And then third step is linking it to your business process. So now we saw how to link it to your business process in lifecycle workflows. We're going to take a quick look on the entitlement management side. And here, if we go in the access package section and we select one of our access packages in our environment, then we can go to the policies. And for those of you who don't know, the policies define how access is, when access is being requested, or who can request access, how is it being granted, which approval processes happen, etc. So we can go into one of these assignment policies. And within the assignment policies, we find all the settings that I just talked about: who can request, what additional information do people have to provide. But most importantly, we also have this custom extension tab. And now here we define at what stage a custom extension is being invoked, and then you select also which custom extension is being invoked. Now this here is the list of custom extensions that are now available within that catalog. If I had multiple extensions in the catalog, I would find all of them. But if there are some extensions in a different catalog that I have, then they wouldn't show up here. So this relates, Jeff, to the point you made earlier about like where is it actually created. Okay, and Jeff, do you think all of our customers are scenarios are satisfied if we can invoke a custom extension when a request is created?
Every scenario, I think it varies depending on what they want, right? I think because of the different stages we have along that life cycle, they can extend it to do whatever they want. So whether it's at create time for notifications or at approval time to take additional actions, I think that framework makes it extensible to do anything.
Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about just a little bit, and we will dive further into that later down in our show. But to show you, when we go here in the custom extension configuration, we can actually in entitlement management select at what stage of the access request or at what stage of the assignment of the access is the custom extension being invoked. And that's a slight difference to what we just saw for lifecycle workflows, because in lifecycle workflows, it's always going to be a task within the workflow. The only thing you can influence on the lifecycle workflow side is basically the order of the tasks. And here you could say, okay, but I want to move I want to invoke my custom extensions all the way on the top, for example. You can change this order, but it's always going to be a task in a workflow. Versus on the entitlement management side, you can actually hook into multiple process steps as part of that access request and assignment process that we have.
And I think that's a good distinction, right? One's the sequential walking of that workflow, and the custom extensions on entitlement management are a little bit more on the event, right? So as I hit that stage or the event in that flow, that's when it triggers this custom extension.
Yes, agree. All right. So with that, we talked about 2 of the 3 steps, right? We saw the creation, we saw how we are going to link that custom extension to our process. But the most interesting part is how do we actually configure our custom business process now, and how does that work on the logic app side? So let's do a quick jump over to one of the logic apps that we just created earlier for lifecycle workflows. And we're going to be greeted with the logic app interface. And just to give you like a quick introduction here, there's a few main pieces that we can look at when if this is the first time for you seeing this. Most importantly, there's the logic app designer, and this is the visual designer where you can configure your business process. And we're going to jump into what does it mean to add steps here and configure this business process. But that's one important puzzle piece, the designer. But then we also have, as a second very important puzzle piece, the run history. So whenever a logic app gets invoked, this is where you can see the runs and if it succeeded, if it failed, You can see the inputs, the outputs, etc. of the execution of the logic app.
And I think that foundation really makes it easy for working with them. I've built a few logic apps, and you may go in looking to see what you expect the flow to be, but if there's an error or you want to see what that outcome was, it's great to actually step through that history.
Yes, agree. And so, yeah, don't be overwhelmed about all the options that you have available here on the left side. The core experience is truly lies for building your business scenario here in the Logic App Designer and the run history. We will jump in a few other blades in a little bit, but these are really the two main puzzle pieces that you need to understand on the Logic App side. So, Jeff, when we start a Logic App from our identity governance features, we probably need some information that is coming over to this logic app. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, where we want to connect the dots, right? I did something over here. Now I want to pass that through to this activity here. And how do we actually pass that information across between that process?
Yeah, so in our scenarios, we are currently leveraging the when a HTTP request is received trigger on the logic app side. So on the logic app, the process always starts on top with a trigger. This is the step that is starting the logic app. And what we can see here is that it contains first a URL. If you have this URL, you're able to call and trigger the logic app. And then secondly, we have the request body. And this is a definition or a schema definition of all the data that is basically flowing over from the identity governance features, lifecycle workflows, or entitlement management. The schemas look slightly different. From the identity governance features to the logic app. So this data that is defined here in that schema will then be available for you to leverage in what Logic App calls a dynamic content when you build your business logic in the next steps. And we're going to take a look at that in a second.
And this is all popular because I instantiated the Logic App with a template, right?
Correct, yes, because we created the Logic App with the custom extension create experience on the governance side. That's the only reason why this trigger is already added here and why the schema is already defined. If you would have created a Logic App from scratch on the Azure portal without any templates involved, then you would have been greeted with a screen where there would have no trigger here, and Logic App would usually ask you, what is the trigger you want to use? But since we already pre-configured that one, it's already here in this case. And so, Jeff, I mentioned something earlier, and I'm sure some folks in the audience maybe might have some questions about that. But I mentioned if you have this URL, you're able to trigger the Logic App. Does that sound secure to you?
Well, that's a question I often get, right? If this is a powerful business process, how do I control who actually can call that business process?
Yes.
So how do we actually constrain that?
Yeah. So what we leverage is actually Logic Apps in general offers like two big mechanisms. One is a mechanism where you have a secret in this URL and you can leverage that. And then the second mechanism that Logic App offers is authorization based on tokens from Microsoft Entra ID. And of course, we're leveraging the second pattern. So in our case, our services, Lifecycle Workflows, Entitlement Management, they will request a token for this specific Logic App. And then on the Logic App side, we have something what is called authorization policies. And within these authorization policies, that's where we will actually check that the call is truly coming from your specific tenant and from Lifecycle Workflows or Entitlement Management. So if we look at this example here, for example, the issuer in that authorization policy contains my tenant ID. So only calls from my Microsoft Entra ID tenant will be allowed to start the Logic App. And then secondly, it's not anyone in my tenant. It has to be this app ID here that we're seeing here is actually the Lifecycle Workflow backend service. So only people that, or only things that control the backend service of Lifecycle Workflows are able to request a token that would contain that app ID and then make sure that the Logic App only gets started from the Lifecycle Workflows that is running in your tenant, not someone else's tenant.
And what I like about this is that because it's part of the template, the consistency, each admin doesn't have to be concerned with configuring it for security, right? So that foundation allows to trigger this in a secure way. So they only really have to focus on the business logic.
Agree. Yeah, we highly encourage you to leverage our template. We will talk later in the show a little bit about what does it mean to make a logic app compatible if you already have one and you truly want to reuse it. We didn't go into that in detail earlier in the creation experience, where we also have an option to say you want to leverage existing logic app, but that puts some responsibility on you, or additional responsibility on you as a customer, to actually configure it in a secure manner and in a compatible way. All right, so one more thing that I want to show here, and then we're going to jump to, and after that, we're going to jump to a little more complex scenarios on the entitlement management side. We're not going to build like a lot of business logic today, but I just mentioned that we have this data defined here. So if we're going to add a new step now, and I will keep this very brief, let's say we want to make a HTTP call. And you want to leverage the data that you just that was sent over. You probably need to know, for example, okay, but if I now want to, for example, create a ServiceNow ticket, right? We would leverage the ServiceNow connector, but what I want to show you is the dynamic content. One information that you for sure need is, but for which user needs the hardware, right? So that is one of the puzzle pieces that comes over as the data. And when we now have one of these options here, let's just say we do a post call here. And then we have the body. And as soon as I click into one of these fields that allows me to put some text into that, that's when this dynamic content window of logic apps pops up. And this has all the parameters that I previously defined that are defined in the schema available. So for example, in Lifecycle Workflows, we have a subject, and the subject is the person for which the workflow is running. So in this case, I could go and say, well, I have a subject display name, or I have a subject user ID. And this is information about, in the scenario, right, the new hire. And I have this information available and can now use it to easily craft the business logic and reference these attributes that I need when building out my business logic.
So in that model, I started out maybe my request in entitlement management. I've passed that through the variables or the metadata to the trigger. The trigger now passes it to make it available to build the business logic from, right?
Correct, yes. And you can see that it's not just information about the user itself. I mean, right now we're still in the lifecycle workflow example. So we have, for example, not just the user that is getting processed, or not just information about the new hire. We also have, for example, information about who is the manager of that person. But we also have specific information about the context of that workflow execution. So you can see we also get something like the workflow ID and the workflow display name. If that's relevant for your branching or your business logic that you want to build.
Makes sense. So I can be dynamic based upon what was triggered to do the actions in the workflow itself.
Correct, yes. And I mean, we have a set of predefined attributes that we are sending over, and this is really to make it easy for you so that you don't have to do extra steps to get additional data. But we also have some customers that will say, but I need very specific information. Like I need, for example, to know which group memberships does this user have today, or like I need access to a custom security attribute that is set on the user account. And that's where you would need additional steps to actually query that data because it's not part of that initial set of data that we're sending over to you. Okay. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to make a jump from a lifecycle workflow example over to the entitlement management side. And we're going to look at a little bit more advanced scenario. And you already see a sneak peek here, but let me go back for a second to the access package actually, and to the custom extensions. So the custom extension that we have here on the entitlement management side, this one is actually of type launch and wait. So we looked at the simple example on the lifecycle workflow side. It's basically, it starts the logic app and then the workflow continues and it doesn't care much about what happens in the logic app. But now here we have the launch and wait pattern. And that's where the entitlement management business process runs. For example, someone makes an access request, and then we're going to start the logic app. But the business process on the entitlement management side, it will not just continue. It will not like go to the next step where it, for example, asks the manager for approval if there's approval configured for the access request. No, instead, in this pattern, the logic or the entitlement management process will actually pause and wait for a response from the external process, in this case, our logic app. And Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about what like powerful scenarios this enables and that you have seen from our customers on the entitlement management side?
Yeah, so one of the things that can happen is you're making a request for access, but maybe that is something that has to be done manually. What do I mean by manual? Like in a physical way, right? So somebody has to go and ship something, or somebody has to go and provide something. Well, you can request, say, an ITSM ticket, and then you want to get confirmation or want to wait until that ITSM ticket is complete and get that response back to continue that process. So maybe I've onboarded somebody with requesting access. I need to ship them a laptop or something. Now I'm waiting confirmation that they've been shipped the laptop to continue on my path on that workflow.
Yes, perfect. That's a great example. And I will add for you, you mentioned someone needs to do something manual. Like another great example for that would be if you have disconnected systems, right? Entitlement management is truly about making sure that people have the right permissions, the right access, right? But maybe you have some systems that you were not yet able to connect to the Microsoft Entra ID platform with our provisioning capabilities, etc. And someone needs to go manually and add that permission in that disconnected system. So that's another venue where it's super helpful. But then we also have the more, in these scenarios, right, that Jeff just mentioned, that I just mentioned, one of the benefits is that since we are going to wait, the end user doesn't get a notification too early that says everything is set up and ready to go for you, right? Like we make sure that the end user that requested the access only gets the notification that their access is provisioned when it's actually done, and not this weird, strange email that will say like, oh, your access might become available in the next 12 hours or something like that. But there's one more powerful pattern for this launch and wait scenario, and that's when you need to perform certain validations. And this might be additional risk checks. It might be additional governance or governance compliance checks that you want to perform. So if you have a scenario where you need to make sure that certain conditions are in place, let's take a easy example. Maybe you just need to make sure that a certain contract is in place, or that someone has completed a certain training, and you need to look that up in your proprietary database for contracts or for training records, right? Then you can also leverage the logic app for that. It's maybe a process that will happen within seconds if you have it automated all the way through in the logic app. But the powerful piece is that now you can, for example, even stop the assignment process or the access request, right? So the system could return and say, oh, but this person doesn't have completed their training. We're going to stop that request right here. We don't even send it to the person that has to approve. Or another option is that even though maybe you find, or the logic app determines that there is no training completion achieved, it could also respond to entitlement management and just provide that information, and then still let it proceed to the next step where it goes to the approval stage, and we can surface that additional information to the approver on my access as well. So that's another powerful pattern where we can actually stop the access request or enrich the access request with additional information that can be provided to the approver.
And I want to highlight here that this is a framework to pretty much do any business process, right? So when we started with the original extensions, let's walk through the entire process to completion, and now we have this new capability for waiting. It really enables the dynamic capabilities, right? We don't have to have this high development cost of building these things. We're taking these components, configuring them, and building in that framework to really enable those business processes.
Exactly, yeah. And so let's take a quick look how that looks on the entitlement management side, or in the logic app side for entitlement management when we use this advanced pattern. So Very similar to what we saw earlier, we still have the when a HTTP request is received trigger on top. We still have our schema defined. Now it's the entitlement management schema that is slightly different. And now I have this very basic example, as I told you earlier, like we don't want to spend a lot of time building custom business logic today, but I have a branching logic, right? So I'm going to make some decisions. Something is going to happen here in my business logic. Maybe I data mine if someone has a contract in place. In this case, it's named as a contract validation. Maybe I'm going to check a training record, etc. But then I'm going to have a result based out of my business logic. And now we have these two examples here. One is continue the access request, and the other one is stopping the access request. And how do we actually do this? So this is a graph call. So entitlement management is actually waiting for a response and for that external process to send back the information via Microsoft Graph. So taking a closer look here, we can see it's going to make a call against the Microsoft Graph endpoint. This is the resume endpoint. And it's going to provide a certain set of predefined information that we need to send over. But most importantly, there's going to be, we will see that in the stop request process, there would be additional parameter if we want the request to stop. This one is not included here right now. So in this case, it's just going to make a successful resume call and tell entitlement management, please proceed. And you can send over some additional information like in this case, we have users FTE, no contract needed as a additional detail that we are sending over. But core pieces we are resuming without telling the entitlement management to stop the request.
Now, one thing I noticed here, and I want to call that out, is you're calling the Graph API, but I see you're not providing credentials to call the Graph API. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, so that's important because we are actually have like a asynchronous pattern here, right? So we are not responding directly when the logic app gets the HTTP request, where we wouldn't need credentials or some kind of that. Since it's an asynchronous pattern, we are making an active call. We need to have some kind of identity, some kind of credential involved. But what we are leveraging here to make that API call is our managed identities that we have available in Logic App and in the Azure Vault. And these are these powerful, nice to have tools that will give our resource, in this case, the Logic App identity that we can authorize in our systems. And we'll take a look at that, how it's authorized on the entitlement management side in a second. But that's what we are leveraging. So we don't have to care about like where's the credential, does it expire? How is it secured? All of these things are abstracted away from you as a customer because we are leveraging managed identities here. So all we need to say is use the managed identity, and the audience is going to be the Microsoft Graph endpoint. The only thing that we have to do is make sure that the managed identity is actually enabled on the Logic App. And there on the left side, you will see there's this identity pane, and all you have to do is like flip it from off to on. You will get a managed identity, and that will actually be represented on your Microsoft Entra ID side then as a special service principal that you can authorize and give permissions to all the things that are authorized with the Microsoft Entra platform. So any service that you have connected there, including, of course, our Microsoft Graph endpoints.
And what I like about this model is I don't have to hard code some credentials in a script. I don't have to have a user object that I've given a lot of permissions to. I actually have this per process identity that I give least privileges to. So I don't have to manage the lifecycle credential, and I can limit the permissions to only do what the business process needs to do.
And we can actually take a quick look. So on the entitlement management side, if we look into the roles and administrator role, we can see that in this case, actually, we can see the managed identity of the Logic App that is authorized within the entitlement management RBAC system here. It's actually I didn't do a good job here, Jeff, because I overprivileged it a little bit. I gave it catalog owner. I could have given it a less privileged role here. So always take care and choose the best approaches here. And
least privilege, yep.
Yeah, very important. And I will take another quick look on the entitlement management side as well. Sorry, on the lifecycle workflow side as well for that. If we go to our custom extensions here, and we choose one that has the wait pattern, then actually we have it defined, because entitlement lifecycle workflows doesn't have its own role-based access control system. Here in the task behavior, if you choose launch and wait, you can actually select the applications that are allowed to respond. And this allows you also to define it from a least privilege perspective. Now, taking a quick step back to our logic app designer, and give it a second to load, I just wanted to call out or take a quick look at the stop request approach as well. So here, it's very similar to what we just saw. It's once again a call against the Microsoft Graph endpoint, the resume endpoint, and we're gonna have, now there is additional property here, which is state, and the state says denied. So basically, this one says the access request that we have just evaluated, that we are resuming, that it's denied to continue its process. So in this case, if someone requested access, they will get an email notification that says, I'm sorry, your process was stopped. And they will also, it will also include the information that we are sending back here, for example, that no contract was found. And this is the powerful pattern where you can make that decision either to, well, maybe just enrich the process on the entitlement management side with additional information, or even take it a step further and stop the process because some compliance checks, some other checks that you performed are not in check for the process to continue. All right, Jeff, I think we saw a lot now. I have maybe one last thing that we can take a quick look at, and that is on the entitlement management side when these logic apps actually get invoked. So let me take a quick look because I think I have some requests here when I made requests in the past where we can actually see that happening. So here we have an access request from the past. And we can, let me take this one here, that one got delivered. So these are the access requests, and we see one for Max here. And within the request details, we can see there is a custom extension instance, and I can click on this instance, and that gives me actually information and shows me the information that was flown back from the logic app. So we just saw that the successful case that we looked at had like user is FTE, no contract needed. And that's actually one call out here. And we also see the external run ID of the logic app so that from a troubleshooting perspective, if there's anything going wrong, I can map it together. And I see the context, how the two features link with each other.
And that's great for whether you're tracing a request or troubleshooting a request. Having that information right in the console here is very helpful.
So if we take a quick look back here and we open the run history on the logic app side, we can see this one was, well, actually, let me just copy it real quick. We can see this was the last one. So this is the run that actually happened. And this is the run history. So this looks very similar to the visual designer that we just saw, but now I cannot change anything. I can just see the run information. So which steps did it succeed? Which path did it actually take? So we can see the green check marks here. And it went to the true path, made the continue request call, and then I can actually see, okay, but with what information did it call back? And I get a bunch of information about the HTTP call that was actually made. So if anything goes wrong, I would see a correlation ID here, etc. And that's how I can trace and troubleshoot the process. Or if I just need to look at it might not always be troubleshooting, maybe I just need to see the history from an audit perspective. That's when I can take a look here as well.
And this is one of the capabilities of logic apps that I really appreciate, is having that what actually happened and giving you that walkthrough instead of having to try to debug it, just looking at logs, being able to interactively step through, see the requests, the response, the variables. It really is helpful when you're first getting started creating logic apps.
Agree. Yeah, this is super helpful in the troubleshooting process. And then and that's truly the last thing, because I know we're running short on time. If we take a quick look at the request history, then we can actually see the full process. So there was an access request submitted, and then it went into the stage of where it performed the call out, and it's waiting for a callback from the external system. And then it tells us here request is created stage resumed. So it was waiting for that external call. It got the external call, and then it went further in the assignment process, and that simply depends on how your policy is defined in terms of sort of 1-step, 2-step approval, what other things need to happen. Maybe you have callouts at multiple stages of the process. That's also possible, but that's where you get like the end-to-end view for the request itself. And we're not going to take a look at it right now, but on the lifecycle workflow side, it's very similar. We have what we call workflow history there, and you can look at the details of the task that got executed, and very similar information that we just saw here would be available on the lifecycle workflow side as well. All right.
That's a lot of great information to have for the admins to look at the request. So it's really great that we included that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Jeff. I think with that, I think we have a little bit more, a last few slides, if I remember correctly, but we'll take a look at that, and then we'll wrap it up in a second for everyone here.
Well, thank you for the walkthrough of the user experience. I think when you're coming from a automation viewpoint where you're writing scripts, coming to as low code, no code, and understanding the framework, I think you can really see how powerful it is and how easy it is to do those complex processes in a simple way. So yeah, let's go back to the deck if there's any other questions. But what Alex is really trying to show here is that the capabilities of customization really are based upon those foundations of Azure Logic Apps, right? Being able to do those complex activities by taking connectors and piecing them together to achieve what that outcome is. Now, I've built many logic apps in the for identity governance, right? So typically customers want to do things like, I want to call the Graph API to call this other thing. I want to open a service ticket, or maybe I want to add training to somebody's tasks when they onboard. So it really becomes open-ended of what you can do, but it really comes down to your business process. So if you're looking at traditional IGA solutions, thinking about what that those tasks are that you're doing during those lifecycle events, joiners, mover, leavers, whether they were manual, now you can automate them and make them consistent and reportable.
All right, I think I'm back. If you can hear me, we should be fine.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Okay, then let's jump a little bit into, well, we wanted to talk a little bit about security, Jeff. So that's an aspect that we had in terms of the logic app. You just mentioned earlier, right, that there are some responsibility that lies with the team that uses logic app, because it is not a full SaaS service, right? It's and you own some responsibility within that subscription that you maintain. And so from that aspect, one thing to consider is who has actually access to that logic app, right? And I'm sure if you're an organization that has deployed Azure services across the board, you have had a lot of conversations around, like, how do you structure your Azure subscriptions? Who has access to them? There are frameworks around them. For example, the Azure landing zones in the Vault architecture framework would be a good part to like design that well and make sure that only the appropriate people have access to these logic apps, especially if they are handling highly privileged tasks, right? For example, I had one customer, I'm sure, Jeff, if you saw that, they were generating temporary access passes and sending them via SMS with a custom extension. We have a functionality where we send where we leverage email for that, for example, but they want to do it via SMS and they use logic apps for that. But that functionality of actually being able to create a credential makes them highly privileged. So keep in mind and the context what you're doing with your logic apps as well.
Now, the security of the operational, who can manage, customize those is key. But what is the security of who can actually call that logic app, right? I know there's a trigger that is created with the template, but what determines who can actually trigger that workflow?
Yes. So on that case, Logic App itself supports multiple authorization mechanisms, how you can make sure that only the appropriate people or apps can call the Logic App and trigger it. In this case, we are leveraging the Logic App authorization policies that are available. And there's actually a regular Microsoft Entra token exchange happening. So it is ensured in that authorization policy that is configured on the Logic App that the Logic App can only be called from entitlement management or lifecycle workflow from your given tenant or environment from the Microsoft Entra side.
That makes sense. So we're defining the code or the logic, and hence logic apps, but it's constrained of who actually can invoke that to the service itself. So even if I had the endpoint, I cannot go there and trigger that workflow.
Exactly. Yeah. And in fact, not even if you were you need access to entitlement management or lifecycle workflow. If you don't have that, you can't do that, because at the end of the day, the service is triggered from our application or from our backend services. So only if you embed them in the business logic, as we discussed, only then you can trigger them. All right, and then one other aspect is, and we will talk about that more in the integration patterns as well, we support scenarios in which you can actually respond to the logic app. You can respond to entitlement management, so feedback can be given back from that external process that is happening, and that is very crucial for some scenarios. For example, these compliance checks that I mentioned, you might not want processes to continue on the Microsoft Entra side, depending on what your business process determines on the logic app side. And so we also have a callback pattern where the logic app can respond to Microsoft Entra and provide that feedback back. And in that case, we have authorization within the entitlement management role-based access control system, as well as in the custom extensions itself, where you can, on a least privilege perspective, define who is allowed to respond to these scenarios where the Microsoft Entra process is actually waiting for feedback from that external process.
Yeah, and I think that's important because not every process is linear, right? So giving the ability to have this more advanced capability to react to that process gives those admins more capability. Now, this is a great way to highlight things that, like, if you're used to running scripts to do actions, now you've got more advanced capabilities in your toolbox, and be able to automate these lifecycle events with these in that no-code way, I think is really great.
Yeah, and then lastly, we also have the scenario where this is closely connected. If you want to provide feedback back to entitlement management or lifecycle workflow, that's a Microsoft Graph call. But you might want to do calls against Microsoft Graph or even non-Microsoft services from an API perspective. And we always recommend to leverage managed identities in these scenarios if it's possible. Of course, it always depends on the connector that you're using in logic apps, on the API surface that you're connecting to, and how that's authorized. But at least for the Microsoft Graph surface and a broader set of other services on the Microsoft spectrum, you can leverage managed identities. And Jeff, do you want to just briefly talk about the big benefits of managed identities?
Yeah, one of the key things is not managing credentials, right? So if you're creating service principals, and this is the identity for an application in Entra ID, you may have the option of using what's called a secret or a password or a certificate or a key, right? You have to manage that. You have to make sure it has the right life cycle. But when we go to manage identities, we're actually connecting that identity of the resource itself in the environment. So we don't have to manage those credentials, but we manage just what that identity can do. So by creating the Azure Logic app, you can enable a managed identity, and you can utilize that to grant access to other services, but without having to manage the credentials, because that's all handled by Azure itself.
All right, and with that, we can dive a little bit deeper in the integration patterns, and that the managed identity topic will become important again, because we have basically 3 patterns that are worth highlighting here. We have a launch and continue pattern, and that basically means that that from a governance perspective, let's take the example of an access request, right? In someone requests access, it might have to get approved, and then after it gets approved, the access gets provisioned, and whoever requested the access will be notified, hey, you now have access to Salesforce or whatever they requested access to. And so in the launch and continue pattern, we are simply adding an additional step in that process where we would reach out to an external system, but we don't really care much about what's happening in that external system. Like, there's no feedback coming back to entitlement management, or there's no influence on the access request and the process of that access request. Versus in that launch and wait pattern, we will actually pause the process and wait for feedback from that external system or the logic app. And that's really the difference. I keep jumping around between external system and logic app, right? Because our customers actually have both scenarios where they also have third-party systems that they want to integrate with. And often I have seen that our customers call out to logic app, but then make a further jump to another internal system to perform a certain task, to check certain things before access requests can continue, for example, and then they actually respond from that external system. So the logic app is just acting as an intermediary, like a middleman, basically forwarding the request, and that opens a lot of possibilities. Because I said earlier we integrate with Azure Logic App, but then we have customers saying, well, but I want to run the Azure function. I want to maybe run a PowerShell script, etc. Right? Like, or I want to integrate with my generic HTTP endpoint with my custom application. Right? Like, there's such a broad set of scenarios that we hear about, and that's where this intermediary pattern also becomes very powerful, where you just leverage the logic app to jump further as well, if you cannot solve your scenario purely with the logic app connectors.
Yeah, I see scenarios customers ask for, like when a user is making a request, I want to go and take the details of that request and use some of that data to query another system, wait for a response from that other system to get the resulting value. So an example may be, maybe I want to do a lookup of a sales code or department code in another system. I want to query that, return it, and then update my user whenever approved it. So it really is a very powerful construct to build those complex processes in a simple way.
Yes, yeah. So I know we spoke about that quite a bit now, but just to visualize it a little bit better, right? This is a basic process where we only have like an employee entitlement management, a manager that approves a request, and a resource system where the access will be given, like, for example, Salesforce. So it's pretty much the process that I just described. Someone submits the access request, entitlement management would request the approval, the request gets approved, then entitlement management will provision or add the authorizations in that resource system, and then afterwards the user will get notified. So that's the basic process without custom extensibility. And of course, this flow can look much more complex. We have multi-step approvals, we have separation of duty checks, all built in natively, for which you wouldn't need custom extensibility that we're talking about today. But if you have that scenario that we don't solve with the other built-in capabilities in these flows, then you can embed it. And in this example here, since it's a launch and continue pattern, we simply trigger the logic app, and we don't care much what happens afterwards here once we trigger the logic app. The entitlement management process just continues. It will request the approval like it did in the basic example. And the logic app might do a lot of things here, but entitlement management will not know about them anymore. And frankly, in some scenarios, you might not necessarily care about that from an access request perspective. And then you have the possibility for this launch and continue pattern. Jeff, do you want to speak a little bit about, like, I know we released this first and we had a lot of requests for the launch and wait pattern. So any insights from you from back then?
Yeah, so, when we first had the feature in public preview, I actually created some videos and shared them out getting started from here. And that was sort of the phase one, where it has also the basic pattern. But with launch and continue, we started seeing customers wanting to do or asking to do more complex scenarios, and that's where launch and continue came into play. So this was a direct result from the ask from customers. So very important. Give your feedback. Let us know how we can improve the platforms to enable your business to be successful in achieving these processes.
And so now, looking at that launch and wait pattern from a sequence diagram perspective, we can see what changes here is that after entitlement management triggers the logic app, it will now pause the request process. So it will not continue with requesting the approval from the manager until it gets resumed from the Azure Logic App in this case. So in this scenario here, the Logic App is triggered. Your dedicated business logic is running in the Logic App. For example, it might be creating that ServiceNow ticket for hardware procurement or other scenarios, right? And then afterwards, once the Logic App or once that process is done, or at least when you know that it's okay for the assignment request or for the access request to continue, then it would send a resume call against entitlement management. And in the Logic App itself, that's a simple HTTP call that we make with the HTTP connector. So similar, like you saw the one action on top earlier in the demo, you would just have one action that calls the Microsoft Graph API with a managed identity and tells entitlement management, hey, please continue or stop the process. And we'll talk about that in a second after we have looked at the last pattern with the intermediary in play. All right, and so in the intermediary pattern, very similar process again. The only difference is the logic app gets triggered here, but now it triggers the customer system or your specific endpoint, and the business logic is happening in that system, and the resume call that tells entitlement management or lifecycle workflow that things are done or that things are okay to continue now happens from that system. Now that's because I designed it that way in this particular flow. I also know about some customers that could even feed feedback back to Azure Logic Apps, and then Azure Logic App resumes, or I have seen customers that have multiple external systems involved. So it might not just be a jump from Azure Logic App to one external system. There could be multiple ones involved. But the core point is that at least one system, if we use this launch and wait pattern, needs to resume the request before it can continue in its regular processes.
Now, I know this is a really good representation of all the processes that are happening behind the scenes. And if you are more of a technical minded, you want to look at some of this information. Do we have this in our documentation today?
Yes, we have one sequence diagram for entitlement management. I can share a link for that.
Yeah, I think the team does have a link they could bring up on screen that links to the custom extensions and the custom tasks for LCW. So we can bring that up.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, I think we have one link for lifecycle workflows, and then we have one link for entitlement management. For both of them, we have the guides basically, and I believe we have a sequence diagram, if I remember correctly, in the entitlement management one. So if anyone is curious in jumping in these bits there, feel free to do so. Okay, one thing that is important, where I mentioned earlier that entitlement management is a little bit more complex or has more steps in the process where you can hook into compared to lifecycle workflows, and that's really because the access request process walks through so many stages, from request being requested, approved, etc. And now I just wanted to give you a quick overview that we support the launch and wait pattern in all of these scenarios from entitlement management perspective. So sorry, that was misspoken. Launch and continue is what I wanted to say. So launch and continue is supported in all of them without any issues. But for some, you can see that we do not support the launch and wait pattern. And why is that? Because sometimes there is not much to wait about. So for example, you can see we support invoking when the assignment expires in 14 days. We cannot stop time, right? Like when it says like your access is expiring in 2 weeks, time continues. So we don't want to block that process. So in that particular case, we can still trigger that external process and say, hey, something needs to happen. But if the 14 days pass and the previously approved access is no longer should no longer be there, then it gets tricky from a compliance perspective if we would block that process there. So in that pattern, we do not support the launch and wait pattern. In the other ones, we do, but not in all of them. You can actually stop the process. So there's a slight difference between providing feedback back to entitlement management versus providing feedback back and then at the same time saying this access request should be stopped, right? It should not proceed anymore. And that this particular, it should be stopped, it should not proceed anymore. That's very important for some of these compliance and risk checks, especially for customers that have like external GRC systems that they might want to integrate with. It's very, very important that we can stop the process. And that's possible. We can perform that when the request is created and when the request is approved. After it's granted and removed, you might wonder, okay, but why do you support a launch and wait here, but not in these other patterns? The one thing that is still happening here is actually communication. And so you can provide feedback back that will be integrated and shown on the My Access portal as well. So If we think about entitlement management, right, we have end users on the My Access portal requesting access. We have people approving there. So if they check their assignments, for example, we can surface information there as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to know to use the right type of workflow or extension at the right stage. So this is a great chart to help customers figure out which one that is.
And so, yeah, maybe just a quick call out, since we would have shown that in the logic app as well. But there's a property basically when we think about these interactions, there's a call out payload that is sent to the logic app, right? When we trigger the logic app, we send certain information to the logic app about the access package, about the user, about the lifecycle workflow that is starting, right? So there's a bunch of information sent to the logic app, and then there's a set of information, a data payload that is being sent back. So when you make this what we call resume calls, and I think we have aka.ms links for that as well, for both features, where you can see what the resume call would look like when you, from a Microsoft Graph perspective, would continue that process or resume that process. And there you can include that property that would basically say, I don't want this thing to continue. And then from a lifecycle workflow perspective, it is a little bit easier because, at least from a launch and continue, launch and wait perspective, we always support it. And we can also stop the workflow in all scenarios. There's additional layer involved with the continue and area configuration of lifecycle workflows though. But in general, we support it in joiner, mover, and leaver processes. All right. Jeff, any thoughts from you about our patterns? Any additional?
Yep, just the highlighting that, again, that common skill set that you can apply across LCW and lifecycle workflows and entitlement management is key, right? So I understand this may be a little getting used to some other terminology, especially if you're coming from a traditional IT admin where you're scripting and running these unscheduled tasks. We're now utilizing these custom tasks in accordance with those workflows or those requests, tying it all together.
And then jumping from that a little bit to the actual I don't want to jump into the configuration itself, but once you jump into configuration of the logic app, you will notice that error handling becomes a topic. So what if some of the tasks, not necessarily the callback to lifecycle workflows and entitlement management, but when you implement your business logic, you make that call to ServiceNow and for some reason it fails, right? You make that call to Salesforce and for some reason it fails. Like, how do you handle that situations where errors occur? And it's there's kind of two patterns that are important to call out. So we have a timeout window, right? So if we use that pause process, you can actually define how long would entitlement management or lifecycle workflow wait for a response. So if we do not get a response after a certain time, it depends a little bit on the configuration, entitlement management, and lifecycle workflow what would happen, but you can make it, you can configure it so that the process would stop. Because if you, from a governance, from a risk perspective, compliance perspective, say that process is needed, and if it fails, I can't this workflow to continue or complete, I can't this access request to complete, then you can say after the timeout, basically the process stops. And then there's also a second pattern that you can use in logic apps itself. It has a lot of error handling, right? So if you have a connector and you make that call to Salesforce, to ServiceNow, etc., and you get an error back, you can handle that in logic apps, and you can send explicitly the failure back to entitlement management or lifecycle workflows and say, hey, I need this to stop because I don't this process ran into an error that I cannot resolve right now, right? The logic app is running unattended. There is no admin in that moment there that can help. So the process would still stop. But the benefit of providing that explicit failure or feedback is that we can surface it on the entitlement management lifecycle workflow side. So you will see it like in the request history, in the workflow history, in our audit logs, right? We have venues to surface that information from a troubleshooting perspective, so that you can link together the feedback that came in and then the logic app run that happened on the other side. Yeah, and then one thing that is worth calling out, there is something called logic apps run after behavior. It basically defines what happens in the logic app as the next step when one step fails, right? That's important when you think about these explicit failure behaviors, because the default behavior of logic app is that when a task fails there, then it stops processing, it doesn't go further. So if you want this explicit area behavior, then you need to make sure the run after is configured so that it continues if the task in the logic app fails, and then you can provide that explicit feedback. All right, and I think that's it. I covered the troubleshooting part already. I spoke to that. I would have loved to jump into that a little bit more. But other than that, I think we covered the main topics. Yeah.
So thank you, Alex. I know we had some technical difficulties, and thanks for those who joined us live. Are not already subscribed to our channel, please definitely do that and check out our other videos. We've talked about LCW, we've talked about the Entra ID governance all up, but we've also covered things like authentication strengths and risk policy. So there is a wealth of information direct from the feature teams who are building these products and explaining how you as an organization can take advantage of them and learn more about them. So thank you everybody for your time today. Look forward to our next session, but keep an eye out to all of our social. Join us on LinkedIn, join us on YouTube, where you will find additional posts and links to the videos of these recordings. Thank you, everybody.